Hello. We'll be extending the order creation endpoint that we created in the first video to add authentication. By enabling authentication, we can also associate properties with the authenticated user. These properties can be used in the integration logic. Specifically, each user will have a property for the Sage 300 customer, and this will replace the customer ID that was being sent with the request in Part 1. The ability to associate any number of properties with the user allows us to make the endpoints secure and robust, which in turn makes them suitable for public use. To allow us to enable authentication against the endpoint, we need to return back to the endpoint setup itself. We open up the endpoint setup, and what we're going to be doing is disabling allow anonymous requests. I'll deselect this checkbox. If we return now back to Postman to make a request to the Sage order endpoint, press send. Now we receive a status 401 unauthorized response. This is because we are not sending any authentication with the request. Now let's return back to IMan and associate a user to allow it to be authenticated with the request. So we return back to the API endpoints and we go assign web users. On the left, we have all of the web users which have been created on this particular IMan instance, and on the right, we've got the permitted users who can make requests to this endpoint. I'm going to select the Sage 300 user, and I'm going to save this. Now, if we go to the web user setup, and we go over to the Sage 300 user, if we double-click, this is the user with which we are going to authenticate against the particular endpoint. Now, for us to be able to authenticate against the endpoint, we need to know the user token. We're going to just be using basic authentication, and we've got a username, and in this case, a password. So if we save this and we return back to Postman, we go back to authorization. We go basic authentication. Put in the password, and we also need to associate an additional header being X-user token. And this equates to the token ID in the user itself. If we now press send, the request has been successful and we have a new order number. Now, in addition to turning on authentication, and as previously mentioned, we have the capability within IMan to associate an unlimited number of properties with the user. In our demonstration, we have previously configured the properties. If we look at the custom properties for the Sage 300 user, one of those is the customer ID, and another is the ship via, which have the values of 1400 and DPD respectively. These values will be merged with the authenticated request, where we will replace the previously mapped customer ID and the ship via code. I'm going to return to the designer, open the integration, and then return to Postman. We will re-enable the debug header and then send another request. When we press refresh, if we scroll over to the right-hand side, we'll see two values coming across. The first one is HTTP user Sage 300 customer ID, and this has the 1400, the value that was associated with the user. And we also have the value for the ship via code, as you can see here. So IMan gives you the ability to define unlimited number of properties, and those properties get merged with any authenticated request against the authenticated user. So with those values, we can go back to IMan and we can remap the fields. So over to the field mapping. As you can see, I've got the Sage 300 customer ID. So I'm going to press edit, map this to the customer number field, move over to page 2, and deselect the customer number field, and I'm going to map the ship via code. Press the green tick to save, and then refresh. As you can see, IMan has mapped the DPD, and we have the customer number as being 1400. If we grab this value, you can see that the customer number is 1400 and the ship via code is DPD. We can now save this. So this concludes the second video of the series. We enabled authentication against an endpoint, how we can associate users with the endpoint, and how we can associate properties or values with the user, which are merged with the authenticated request, which can then be used through the integration logic for things such as customer IDs and other values. Thank you for your time, and hopefully we see you for part 3.